Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Alan Jones, Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral, and the title of today's forum is frighteningly appropriate. Draining the Polarization Swamp, Some Help and Hope in These Turbulent Times. And even though polarization has been on the rise and civil discourse on the wane for some time, these trends seem to be at new extremes as we enter 2018. I am so happy to welcome my friend Rob Fersh. I think we're like Abbott and Costello or whatever, in the sense that my tendency is to have a cosmic vision of things and complain all the time. And it's useless, really, but I enjoy moaning. And then someone like Rob comes along who has he's very grounded, but he actually wants to work on some solutions. So I think you're an important figure for me in that sense. So the debates over the past year on healthcare, taxes, we might talk about a tax reform bill, and immigration, the government shutdown, demonstrate that too many of our national leaders are further entrenched along hard party lines, often assigning blame and ascribing motives before having real conversations to understand what the other side believes. So it's not surprising that we suffer from a profound lack of trust in our government, in our institutions, and in the people who lead them. And it's all deepening, I think. So I think a lot of us are asking if there's anything that anyone can do to reverse these trends. Now, some time ago, I came across an organization called Convergence, Center for Policy Resolution, founded in 2009 by today's guest, Rob Fersh. And Convergence works to establish trust, find common ground, and bridge divides across a wide range of areas. And it seems to me this is urgently needed. And the conviction that I get when I complain is, well, the old phrase, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. You can are you going to make things worse, or are you going to contribute to something? And so Rob has had a tremendously long career in searching for common ground in many ways, alleviating hunger in the United States with the Food Research and Action Center, and serving on the staffs of 3 congregational committees. And he's just the person to help us navigate that polarization swamp.
I know we're at a cathedral, but it's 3 congressional committees.
What did I say?
Congregational.
Did I really say that?
But it's also true I've served on multiple congregational committees as well.
So, and in his local synagogue, he served on several congressional committees. It's my eyes, they're going, you know. So please join me in welcoming Rob Fersh. So thank you for joining us this morning. Now, I'm just going to try and be as brief as I can so we can get to your mind. The President gave his first State of the Union address less than 2 weeks ago, and so we could open the conversation with your State of the Union or the State of Congress address. And just to introduce this, I went back in history a bit and read of theologian Lyman Abbott, who identified the contradictions at the heart of the Gilded Age that long ago. And he said, politically, America is a democracy. Industrially, America is an aristocracy. And it's interesting that's 100 years ago. Has much changed. So give us a State of the Union address, but not as long as Trump's one. But
Well, first, thank you, Alan, for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you all for coming out. A lot of old friends and family are even here, so very nice to be with you. And I hope we'll have a chance, obviously, to interact with all of you through the morning. You know, sitting where I sit, I take great care about what I say about the State of the Union. And as someone who works every day with people of vastly different political perspectives, I have a great respect for people who have different points of view. And so I don't think that's the issue with the State of the Union, the fact that people have different points of view. And I often say that if you're trying to deal with the issues of the day, don't react to the most extreme or intolerant people who forward any particular point of view, but understand the basis of the thinking underneath. So, for instance, we have on our board a phenomenal human being, Stuart Butler, who spent 35 years at the Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative think tank. And he and I are now joined at the hip, trying to move Convergence's mission forward. I learn from him every day because he takes a more conservative view of what ought to be done in the country, and I take a more progressive view on a personal basis. Officially at Convergence, I'm neutral as I can be. So here's what I'd say, Alan, about the State of the Union, sitting where I sit at Convergence, which is this, and you said it in the opening. I'm deeply concerned about what's happening to how we treat each other, how we see each other. I feel like I've not seen such anger in the country and such dissension since, frankly, the Nixon administration. And when I was a child in college in the 60s, where people were angry at each other and impugning motives, and we had, middle America was a term of criticism from people on the left toward the right. So I'm concerned a lot about what's the state of the mind of the country. What's our ability to talk to each other, to hear each other, to be respectful of each other, to eventually see the underlying humanity of everybody. And I think that's the central part of what we try to do at Convergence, which is to get past the ideological arguments and to have people engage in a way that can be constructive. When people disagree, it's actually very healthy for a society. You can push each other's thinking. But when we get to the point where we can't respect each other, where we can't pull people together, where we actually don't regard the truth as something that's probably more important than anything else, then I think we're in trouble. And I would say that I think it's been accelerated over the last year, but there's been certainly a strong trend for many years, whether you look at social media, the media, proliferation of interest groups that play gotcha politics that has coarsened our culture. So for me, the State of the Union is we need to get underneath all this to try to create this kind of, if you will, loving society we all want. At some level, we all want a loving society. We all think we're right. We have to find a way to live with each other. And in that regard, I am quite upset and concerned. But I'm not upset that people have different viewpoints about how to make people prosperous, how to create economic mobility, how to create a great economy. People can disagree about that, so long as it's an honest disagreement and people are agreeing on the goals. And the goals are to have everyone prosper and to lead lives of, lives where they can thrive in their own communities.
There's I read a book review, a book called American Niceness. Have you seen that?
I have.
American Niceness, A Cultural History, which is asked how far do we live in a culture of coarseness, falsehood, and exhibitionism, and that we've lost the importance of institutions over personalities. So it's often an argument about personality. There's a New Yorker cartoon in this week's New Yorker, which to me sums up the cultural problem, and it's a boardroom, and the chairman of the board is saying to the board, "Granted, it would save countless lives, but to what end?" And that kind of indifference exalted into sort of principle, I think. So how you foster a conversation. So what are your grounds for optimism? How dare you?
Well, it's days like today that give me optimism. Look, I think most people really want the same things. And I'm concerned about how angry people become and how frustrated they get the sources of news from one side or the other. But I think most people really don't wish harm on other people. Most people want to live in peace. Most people want people to live with opportunity. And I'm optimistic. I will simply say from our day-to-day work, we do bring people together who no one thought could ever even talk to each other. I can tell you about one of our projects in economic mobility, where at the first meeting, a woman from a certain group would not even sit at the table with a leader of another group. And by the end of the year-long sessions, they were embracing each other, understanding each other, able to work deeply together. So, we're one microcosm of what can happen. But in my view, people are put in either good systems and structures that bring out their best, we create cultures that bring out their best, or we don't. So I'm actually optimistic that if we can create cultures of, as we've talked about, building bonds of friendship, of understanding across people, there's no limit to where that can go. But we have our work cut out for us. There's a lot of forces going against
Building
us.
trust. What have you got a project on about the budget process? And
Yes, we do, Alan. So some of you may have noticed that the government's had some ups and downs lately in terms of staying open. And I wish I could claim this was pure genius on our part, but about almost 2 years ago, the Hewlett Foundation out here funded us to do a project on the federal budget process, which some people think is somewhat broken. You may have seen that we just went through 2 short-term closures of the government. And what you may not know is that in the legislation that passed about a week ago, not a week ago, just a few days ago to keep the government open, I'm a little jet lagged, got in late last night. There's actually a whole provision that calls for a special select bipartisan committee on the federal budget and appropriations process. Well, for the last year and a half, we have gathered not just experts on the federal budget process, but lobbyists on behalf of Chamber of Commerce, the Koch brothers, the Liberal Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, anti-hunger organizations, healthcare organizations, infrastructure, veterans, elderly groups. And to a person, none of them has as their primary concern the process by which we create budgets. And they actually all disagree on how they would spend the money. Some would want more for defense, some more for the poor. But they all think this process is broken, that it creates tremendous costs. Think about the costs it creates, not just the federal government, all the contingency planning, the state governments can't rely on it. Some of the best contractors no longer want to apply and work for the government because they never know if the money's going to come through. And think about the trust that's lost with the American public that we actually operate something other than what some people called a banana republic type of process of passing budgets. So remarkably, I'm here to tell you that last Wednesday we put the finishing touches on a consensus document that all these groups have agreed could improve the federal budget process. And what's good about that is that all these groups came in thinking, well, I'm worried about a process that's going to bias the results toward one result or another. So the process reforms we're coming up with and we're going to release on February 26th in a major event on Capitol Hill are seen as fair by people on the left, on the right, people who never want to see another dollar revenue raised by taxes, and people who feel we don't tax people enough, whatever your point of view. And so we have a very timely opportunity to potentially make a difference on a huge issue. And let me also say that nothing is going to reform Congress on that alone, that there's a general dysfunction we're fighting, but we think having these kinds of groups behind ideas to help fix the process and their articulation of the huge costs to the country by not fixing the process will help lend political momentum, hopefully, for Congress to then go ahead and make reforms. And the fact that Congress is setting up its own commission now to deal with it means that our ideas should be very timely and we hope will be listened to.
could you say something then about getting people in the room? Particularly, say, for example, on education reform. I mean, about how you get the unions in the room and the people who are for a different kind of vision of education. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, well, thanks. So we're often asked this question, how do you get these people who disagree in the room? So Alan's referring to, we now are 5 years into a project on K through 12 education where we have teachers unions, national teachers unions, charter school networks, other school reform groups, school administrators, technology companies, other people who've actually come together for a shared vision of what K through 12 education could look like. It's quite a transformative vision and will take a long time to implement, but they're all excited working hand in hand with it. And someone might say to us, well, who are you? Who anointed you to bring these people together? And all I can tell you is that we take our time to do painstaking research, and we're very much a relational organization, so we get to know people. And what we find out is most people are really frustrated with how things are. Most people have only taken the tack that says, well, we'll fight for what we believe, and it's kind of a win-lose tactic. Mm-hmm. And when we get underneath it all, we actually find that most people actually agree on ultimate goals, they disagree on how to get there. And they're often relieved to have a possibility that they can sit with people they disagree with and maybe make progress. And the more success we've had, the easier it is to make that sell. But the important thing, Alan, is eventually to get some anchor stakeholders, people who are influential in that field, who actually are sort of tired of fighting and losing, or tired of fighting and getting a half loaf, and potentially see the value of sitting down with people they disagree. So when it came to education, we had real difficulty getting it off the ground, but eventually went to someone who's a huge player in this field, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randi Weingarten, if you know that name. She's not exactly a wallflower. She's an outspoken, effective union leader. And so who do we go in with? We went in with Stuart Butler, who she knew as a conservative as someone she could dialogue with. It turns out that Randy and I went to the same college at Cornell University, and the former dean of that college taught her, literally, collective bargaining. So we brought him in from Ithaca, New York, and he came in. And altogether, we ganged up on Randy to say, here's a possibility, and we won her over. And then when she came in, it meant other people wanted to be in. They felt like, so you build it out. You build it out one person at a time, and you build out trust in you, and then you also paint the possibility that you don't have to operate in a win-lose environment, that it may be a possibility that everybody could win. And so that, and as Stuart would say, a little Pinot Noir, a little listening, a few dinners, and so on, you eventually can get people at least take the risk or come to an initial meeting, and then normally, because of the quality of the conversation, the respect we're able to build in a room, people want to stay in. They often say, we can't have these conversations anywhere else. And it's a relief to them not to be so tied up with sort of hatred and fear and distrust of other people. They begin to see these people as full human beings, and they begin to see past the motives they ascribe to people to actually see what they're about, and it's usually not as evil as they thought to begin with.
How, when I can understand all these initiatives, and we've talked about them, about wealth disparity, the whole issue of healthcare, the big issue of long-term care, that we have these ideas floating around, and you get people in the room. What's the point of connection of actually getting it into Congress and changing legislation? I mean, what's the kind of mechanism by which you've got these people in the room about education?
Yeah.
The educational system seems broken. People have different visions of what education's about. Some people have it to be practical, and you've got to get skills for getting jobs, and others see it's more conventional, developing wisdom and character. I mean, what's the point of contact, since you're in Washington, of actually having an effect on Congress?
Well, it depends on the issue, Alan, and just because we get people to agreement doesn't mean that Congress necessarily just says, thank you very much, we'll take it from here. And just to be clear, some of our projects don't actually go to legislation. So with education in the beginning, we thought maybe it would devise a successor to No Child Left Behind. Tremendous frustration in the country with the testing regimes and what was happening to the role of teachers. And as it turns out, all the groups we have working on this, and once we completed this vision, our project's now 3 times the size. People like Gates and Chan Zuckerberg and others have come in with pretty big money. And that's very much a grassroots strategy. We're working with people around the country, we're training them, we're creating communities of practice so people can learn from each other. On legislation, by design, we try to bring to the table people who have the collective knowledge and influence so that if they reach agreement, Congress is going to find it of great interest, and also potentially there'll be political cover for what we want to do. So in the last year, we've had a very high-level group of people debating health care and trying to find a middle ground between replace and repeal or Affordable Care Act forever. And these are people literally who get on the phone with senators and congressmen and key staff. And so when they issued a series of statements, it held great weight, and in some cases provided a doorway for bipartisan cooperation that people on the Hill themselves couldn't create. Right. So again, on our economic mobility, which would be a combination of suggestions about things employers could do better, philanthropies could do better, communities could do better. There'll be also legislative items. And the fact that we have the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO and community groups and several individual businesses like Walmart and McDonald's all begin to speak from the same hymn book, if you'll pardon the expression, we think is credibility and lift. But it doesn't, as you say, there's no automatic translation to the policy, although we do, through the stakeholder groups, all have deep connections usually to Congress, and they're informing people and keeping them, bringing them along, hopefully to the point where they want to take action. But we're very patient. It doesn't happen overnight. Our long-term care recommendations came out 2 years ago, and there hasn't been quite an opportunity yet for them to move forward, but they really were bridging ideas between left and right. And when Congress gets ready to take that up, then our ideas will be ready to go.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the issues that I remember in a meeting in Washington, this whole issue of nutrition and food and
right.
How Campbell's Soup fits in with all this sort of thing. How you work with a broad spectrum of people concerned with the food industry, for example, and how you have what the place of regulation is and so on. So how do you get those? I'm thinking of the sort of Campbell, I don't know, I have nothing against Campbell's Soup. It's just the size of it, you know.
Yeah.
How do you get those people in the room, and what do they have to offer?
So some of it's just, you know, good fortune and connections. But let me just back up a second for those uninitiated. The theory of convergence is that we have huge national issues where people have different points of view. And we just simply ask the question, who would need to talk to whom and reach agreement to move the dial forward on those issues? And we engage in a lot of research. As you know, people may suggest an idea, and there's no shortage of divisive issues in the country. You may have noticed there's a few things that get people upset. Mm-hmm. In the case of our work on nutrition and wellness, which was one of the first projects we took on, we're only going on 9 years old, it so happens that a vice president of Campbell's Soup sits on our board. He is somebody I met in 1996 when I was running a national anti-hunger group, and we were set up to debate each other. And he was defending Newt Gingrich's contract with America, and I didn't have the same view he did on that. But we became friends. We had coffee afterward, and I saw this as a person of great decency who wanted to solve problems. He later, he was working on the Hill then, became a vice president of Campbell's Soup. And early on in Convergence, he said to me, Rob, I've never been in a session with consumer advocates where they haven't walked out in protest because we're big business, we're big food, all we do is we're only out there to make the money, and whatever products we'll sell, and that's really not what we're about. So there we had an in to Campbell's Soup. He actually suggested the idea and began to put some financial support into it. So he then was committed to this, and he then reached out to other members of the food industry. And the harder groups to convince to come actually were the consumer groups, because they felt like, no matter what, the bottom line of the food industry will run what they care about, and how can we really have a dialogue about more healthful eating if they're driven by the bottom line? Well, what our research revealed was that there were a whole bunch of food companies that said, if you can help us improve our bottom line by serving healthier foods, we'd like that. We, in fact, have employees and children and aunts and uncles who we don't want to have suffer from obesity and diabetes. And we came together and we had a remarkable dialogue where people understood each other, and the decency of people on all sides was seen. And then, frankly, that people heard about it, and we started with 20 people, and by the end of the sessions, we had 60 people in the room because they just wanted to be in a place where they could be heard and work together. So I don't know if there's any magical answers other than one person at a time, you build it out. I often say we start with a small, the middle of concentric circles and build out. Bring in people of diverse points of view and connection. Have them get buy-in and say, well, who else can you bring in? Who else do we need to be at the table? And we're thrilled, literally, that in our economic mobility project, we have McDonald's, and we have Walmart, and we have IBM sitting with the chamber, and we also have the Federation of Independent Business. And then we have all sorts of other progressive and liberal groups at the table, and other experts from left and right, and they're having a very frank exchange, and they're finding common ground, not optimal ground for everybody, but compromises that, in this case, they feel can make a difference that are better than current policy.
I've got a delicate question.
Yeah.
Because we're here in the cathedral, and you have a deep religious sensibility and commitment. How does your deep and I think wonderfully humane commitment to Judaism fit in with your vision of what you're up to?
Well, it's an interesting question. You should ask this. And I have my sister's here from Toronto, happens to be in Berkeley with her husband. And actually, we've never been in a setting where I've actually spoken before. She's probably amazed I can put a couple sentences together. I think both of us would probably point to the rabbi that influenced us when we were kids. We had a rabbi who was a rabbi in Berlin and escaped, I believe, in 1939. Judy, do you know if that's the right year, about then?
Just in time.
And then he came to U.S. and eventually settled in Poughkeepsie, New York. And his was a voice of moral clarity. And he imbued in us the need to really make a difference in the world, what people now call tikkun olam, repair of the world. And he was also someone who, you think about this, 25 years after he escaped Hitler and the Nazis, was marching for civil rights in the South. And for us, I think we even had these conversations. Is he a Republican? Is he a Democrat? We never knew. His was a statement of values. So in addition to whatever else I find attractive about being in my faith, and I'm a particularist, I love being Jewish, I'm also a universalist. I really believe in the value and contribution of every religion. It imbued in us a sense of social justice. But I think you have to do social justice. But for me, it's also who you are as you're doing it. Actually, to prolong this answer a little, about 2 years ago, I was invited to speak at an adult education class at my synagogue. And the average age of people in the room was probably about 95 or higher. And I shocked them a little bit because I said, the notion of repair of the world, making the world a better place, is a dangerous idea. And I said to them, I actually think that the people behind ISIS think that they're making the world a better place. So one has to be very careful. So what distinguishes one person's vision of how to make the world a better place from another? And it gets down to, what are your values? Do you relate to the golden rule? Do you talk about how do you treat people? Treating people as you would have them treat you. If it's not tied to some fundamental values about how you're repairing the world, and you are always letting the ends satisfy the means, justify the means, then is a big problem. And I would simply say, at least for starters, a longer conversation, that we were raised in a synagogue where these values were so present, and we heard that clarion call to values, but also how people should treat each other. So do good in the world, but how you do it is very important.
Yeah. Well, what I admire and love about Judaism, and the fact that actually Convergence at its inception had three of you, a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian, to sort of work this thing, is two things. One is the sense of covenant, that we're related by covenant, and the other is the rabbinical method of interpreting Scripture is endless argument. So you have this both open thing, and it seems to me what I get from Convergence, which unites us, which unites people of all religions of good faith and people who don't believe it either, is that my two things are very simple-minded. One is everybody matters, and we're in this together. And the rest are footnotes to that, about how we tell stories, and we work with that. And I would say, I think I've told you this story about when I did a conference about 40 years ago in New York with rabbis and priests on holiness. There was an old rabbi who'd survived Auschwitz, and I asked him about orthodoxy. And he said his first test of orthodoxy was, if you were in charge, would I be safe? And I've never forgotten that whole notion of trust. And you talk a lot about trust. How do we develop trust and model that trust? And what kind of, do you have any sense of hierarchy or urgency in the projects that you're working on? I mean, is there something that we really got to spend some more time doing this because of the situation we're living in right now?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, and I appreciate the perspective you're bringing out. You would have made a fine rabbi. So, So,
The first wedding I did in New York broke all the rules. I was young, and the mother of the bride thought I was a lovely rabbi. And we never told her.
it must have been a Yiddish accent.
Yeah. That's right. Yiddish and British. Yeah.
So, what can I say? In some ways, every project we do, we hope is contributing to a culture of cooperation. This budget process table is probably the most diverse table. We're literally, and I'm so heartwarmed by this. We had a little reception to celebrate the agreement, and we had the most liberal group in the room, who we barely could get to the table because they thought the budget process was going to be just sort of a cover for people who wanted to go in and attack the entitlement programs. They're going to use the process as a backdoor cudgel to do that. And we have a woman who's from a very conservative group, and she's been affiliated with the Koch brothers, and she's really, a wonderful human being, but associated with, cutting entitlement spending and worried about the fiscal future of the country in a way that scares certain liberal groups. And at the end, to actually see them embrace and talk about, let's get together for lunch next week. If somehow the collective influence of what we do is to create all these ripple effects of people who see the world differently and see each other differently, that, I don't know if we're enough. We couldn't create enough ripples on our own that we can do that, but we feel like that makes a difference, and it happens in every project we do, where people literally say, I can't see the world the way I used to, which is great. It doesn't mean you have to give up what you believe, but your expansions, your worldviews are expanded. But to your point, Alan, and I'm struggling with this, and I hope maybe somebody here in the audience will help, is I was recently in a conversation with a fellow by the name of Bill Urey, who wrote the book Getting to Yes, if those of you know Bill. He's on our leadership council, and we had this conversation where, he's an anthropologist, and he said, Rob, I love what you're doing, but the truth is there'll be a never-ending stream of conflicts that are intractable that only Convergence can take on once they've gotten beyond the normal political process of people finding common ground. And he posed the question, which is there something we can do more upfront, upstream, to have conversations so that we're not so divided on so many issues down the road? And I think we'd like to make that inquiry. Is there some conversation we can have that people of great decency can have about, well, what kind of society do we want to create? I know we all have strong opinions about this particular issue, but when you look at a mega picture, when you see the anger, and you see the frustration, and you see the intolerance, is there something else that can happen? I happened to have been in a meeting a couple of months ago with President George W. Bush's son-in-law, and I was just reminded he really subscribes to his wife's grandfather, George H.W. Bush, called for a kinder and gentler society. And whether you liked his policies or not, it was about treating people with great decency and honoring their humanity. So I believe that's not a partisan issue. And I think we're looking for, who could we bring together, begin to think about, are there some sort of meta forces that are driving us apart, where if we took some actions to change the culture, how we interact, how we see each other, maybe there would be less division and even less, and more problems solved without the need for groups like Convergence to even get involved.
So, what are you doing about California? I hear there's something in the wind.
Well, I'm trying to think of a witty answer. What are we doing about California? Well, one of the people leading that effort here is Daniel Bowling. He's sitting here. He's a dear friend of mine. And this is just an indication. We're out here this week. We have our so-called Leadership Council meeting on Thursday. We're now close to 90 people in this area want to come and learn about our work and contribute. And several members of our Leadership Council are here, and good friends. I won't go through everyone's name, but appreciate your being here. A year ago, we came and held this meeting, and Daniel, who apparently has been, he's what we call our convergence whisperer out here. He brought a couple of colleagues. One's a former chair of the Republican Party in California. One is a woman who ran for the Assembly and narrowly lost. And they came to me after that meeting to say, California needs this. Sure, it's a one-party state, but we need a capacity to bring people together on issues. So they have been working, God bless them, on a pro bono basis to try to create this presence out here. They're working to actually organize a California healthcare initiative. But beyond that, their vision is, on issue after issue, Californians could come together across different sectors and parties and have conversations, and finance is better than what anybody started with. That's the vision. We've had inquiries from other parts of the country, but it takes people who've got some gumption and want to put some sweat equity in order to build something out. But we hope they'll be successful, and I'm sure Daniel, raise your hand so people know who you are. I'm sure if people want to get involved with Daniel, who's an extraordinary mediator and a mentor of mine over the years, we'd be happy to have the help of people to build out this capacity in California.
We're going to open it up to you in the audience, and if you could write your questions down, and there's a real top prize for being legible, that would be helpful, and then we'll open it up. But I wanted to sort of give you a chance to write your questions down. I wanted to ask you about the thorny question of immigration, because when I became an immigrant, it was by accident, and it was easy. English, 1964, and I went to the American Embassy as a student, and I didn't know there was a student visa. So I filled in the forms for becoming an immigrant. And so when I arrived in this country on the student ship, I had to go in a different line from all my friends. I had this big manila envelope, and I got a green card. And I could stay after they had to return. So it was a happy accident, and then in 1975 I became a citizen. I've had it easy. But there's a sense in which what I enjoy about this and marvel at this country is that we're a mongrel people. There's no such thing as a pure-blooded American, not even Native Americans. And how we live together and respect each other, or try to. Just coming here on the bus from home, going on a California #1 bus is hysterical in the rush hour. And I'm very proud to be an American in those days. Actually, it's chaos, it's noise, it's children, it's all sorts of different backgrounds. And America at its best. But I wondered, where I feel you're talking about vision, about what America's about and what we are about, and I think immigration, the notion of immigrants, is an important part of that center of things, partly because I feel grateful and partly I feel guilty in the sense of I just had such an easy path into citizenship.
Well, for me it's always difficult to clarify what do I think as a human being versus what do I think sitting at Convergence. And so in these settings, I have to look at it, well, who needs to talk to whom to get a solution to these issues? What seems sort of odd and almost tragic in my mind is I felt there was a pretty broad consensus during the George W. Bush administration, where lots of people felt there was a way to balance the interests of security and opportunity, if you will. And I had a lot of direct conversations with Dr. Richard Land, who used to be with the Southern Baptist Convention, and he made clear the evangelicals really felt as a moral basis that there was an opportunity here to create that right balance. I'll simply say as an observation that the election has elevated a point of view which I think may be a little more toward the fringe than what had been the mainstream before. And it doesn't mean that some of these concerns aren't legitimate, but the claims and counterclaims and the sort of stands taken during elections where you feel like you have to fulfill an election promise, I think may be outweighing the kind of rational interaction we need to have here about what are there, if there are legitimate concerns and can we solve problems. One of the shortcomings of Convergence is that we're not always the best at dealing with very hot-button political issues where the solutions are going to be maybe more politically driven than actually once you get consensus on ideas. Now, we are doing healthcare, and I think we've interjected ourselves in a very constructive way. But I would...
thanks.
I think I've tried to artfully dodge that question.
Well, there's
pretty
a
well.
very good, passionate question here, which I resonate with. What can we do about the loud, disruptive voice of the president? And this is not so much a partisan. He says, what will keep me from despair, from the constant, reckless, dishonest conduct from the White House? I mean, what is it like to sort of live in a society where you can't have a conversation because the fake news keeps getting in the way, and the nation of language. So I don't know what we can say except, ally yourself with people who see that as a problem and have a deeper vision. Mm-hmm. I don't know what we could.
I'll simply say this.
Something encouraging.
Yeah, well, I will say here's what's encouraging is I'm aware of all sorts of people of all different political persuasions who are in this conversation about what's the health of our democracy. Right. People very far right, people far left, and I think we will need to work well with people in the Trump administration. I think the president has some unusual qualities that make that more difficult. And there's a lot of things that at least what we see in terms of how he performs, are at odds with some of the values that we preach. But I think the important thing is that we have a resilient democracy, that whether people like, let's say, the president's economic policies or not, or certain other policies, deregulation, there's a lot of business groups, there are a lot of people who feel that some of the most fundamental values about how we should treat each other and how we should lead government and so on are at stake. And I would say that a lot of serious conversations are underway, which are, I think, responding to what I think has been a long-term trend, as you mentioned, loss of confidence in public institutions, but certainly accelerated by the unusual behavior the president exhibits. It's certainly well beyond the bounds of whatever we've seen within a presidency. And I guess my hope would be, whether it's future Republicans or future Democrats, that people not feel they have to one-up that, they have to respond in kind, that we bring people back to what are the values by which we want to lead. And again, it's creating the culture. It's not about pulling your punches, by the way. It's not about that.
Mm. Well, actually, there's a good practical question here, is how people here and elsewhere, how do people get involved with Convergence? Grassroots, how do people who are not in leadership positions, who may be minorities, how do you encourage people to get involved with Convergence?
It's a great question. It's a great challenge. We're a small organization. We're 26 people. 2 years ago, we were 12 people. So we've been growing. We have a model to try to make an influence on big national issues. And we are studying right now what could be our multiplier effect. So some of you in California, I encourage you to be in touch with our California founders here, and Daniel certainly can talk with you, and he's got colleagues. Beyond that, you can get on our mailing list, you can get our newsletters. We also are, I see Rick Callahan's here from Chicago, so nice to see you here, Rick. We're also preparing materials. We want to have a so-called multiplier effect. We don't feel like we have the truth, but we think we have some insights how to do this. So to the extent people want to begin to employ these methods, we hope to have materials soon that you can use. If we can find funding, either you can find funding or we can find funding, we can consult with you and help you do processes if you really want to throw yourself into it. And of course, if you can't give up all your time and energy, we welcome people giving financial contributions. We are a group that is not rich in resources. We are a difficult sell. Most people who fund the actual solutions they want to see. And we're a process organization above all. We're an organization that says, yes, we have agreement on a goal. We're going to increase economic mobility, or we're going to reduce the rates of recidivism in our prisons, which is one of our newest projects. Or we're going to find a doorway on healthcare. We're not going to tell you in advance exactly what that is, because we trust the process that if we put in people who have great knowledge and influence and actually buy into whatever the goals are established for the project, increase mobility, reduce incarceration, then the answers that will emerge will actually be good for everybody, because if those groups who are already on opposing sides can reach agreement, you can feel pretty good about that. So we don't have an answer for the average citizen who just wants to get involved day to day. We don't have that capacity, but get on our list. Maybe you'll have an idea. Ideas for projects can come from anywhere. You may like your ideas. You may decide, and there are groups out here doing this, you may decide, well, I want to have a better conversation with my neighbors so we understand each other better. And our methodologies may help you do that, or we can connect you to people who do work at the grassroots level. We do not do so much.
There are some very good questions here that are sort of combined together. One of the things that person has interested me, although I find him very impenetrable as well, a French anthropologist called Bruno Latour, who talks about not only what we say to each other, but the importance of tone and tonality and pitch, how things are pitched. And so you can actually hear someone where every statement is true, but you still smell a rat, because the spirit isn't there, the kind of connection. And there's two or three questions about what kinds of people you're becoming and how you face into it. There's a good question here. It seems as if there can be tremendous ripple effects from people with opposing views meeting in person. What is the role, if any, of meeting virtually? Would you ever recommend it, the virtual meeting? There is a humility in deliberately withholding one's views to allow conversation. Is there a downside to this forbearance ever in convergence work? That whole notion of when to speak, when to be silent, and how to handle conflict. What do you think?
Well, let me attempt maybe one at a time.
If you have someone with a different value system, this is another question, but I'll give it to you as well. When they have a different value system as you, attempts to use harm or force to get you to do whatever it is they want you to do. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so all great questions, and let me see if I can sort of synthesize. So first, we find that person-to-person, in-person contact, at least at the beginning, is essential. There's science about this, like 80% of communications is nonverbal. It's your body language. It's who you are. And for us, it's just as important the actual sessions where people can form bonds when they learn new things together, by the way. There's all different methodologies to build trust. It's not just, we gather in a circle and do exercises or sing Kumbaya. It's about hearing each other's fears and your motivations and everything else. But, there's no substitute, and there are other people in this room who are experts at this, for personal interaction. And we always build in time for meals. We purposely sit people together who probably wouldn't know each other. We don't allow cliques to arise. We most often try to have 2-day meetings. So it's remarkable what happens if you've had a day to digest an argument and you sleep on it, and maybe you get a little perspective and you bring people back. We have ground rules. We bring in some of the best facilitators in the country, not even usually on our staff, people who are brilliant about understanding what the cues are, how to have people work, and the ground rules include the fact you respect each other's points of view, you don't impugn motives, you're respectful of each other's time. And frankly, what we're able to do, I think, is to create this culture where once we have agreement on if you have agreement on what the goals are, that's a big step forward. Let me tell you one quick aside on this. The first project I ever did was before Convergence. I was incubating the idea of Convergence at a wonderful organization called Search for Common Ground. And I got a call one day from a leading healthcare advocate, and I suggested a process of involving the major leaders in healthcare in the country in a conversation about how to solve what was then problems of 48 million people didn't have insurance. This is pre-Obama. This is 2003, 2004. And this person said to me, I'm interested because I have a view on how to cover the uninsured, and so does everybody else, and everyone's second choice is status quo as opposed to is there some middle ground. So we eventually were able to pull people together and create, through force of personality and openness, create an atmosphere in the room. And there's one story that stands out. In the first meeting, which was actually rife with tension, we knew everybody, but not everybody knew everyone else, and some people had a history of fighting with other people. We went around the room and we didn't ask people for their positions, and then the parlance of the field. I see Bruce Edwards is here, and Daniel, everyone's an expert on this. There's a difference between positions and interests. If you can get people to focus on their underlying interests, as opposed to their exact solutions, there's room for creativity about how to meet your interests. So, and I'm probably giving Stuart Butler undue attention, but here's Stuart Butler, who's in a room with a bunch of other people. He's at the Heritage Foundation at the time. Many people are really worried about on the left, what the Heritage Foundation is going to say. And we're going around the room, and the question was, why are you here, and what are your goals for this process? And I noticed a bunch of the progressive groups kind of went first, and they saw yet Heritage Foundation hadn't gone yet, the Chamber of Commerce hasn't gone yet. And most of them sort of pulled their punches. They said things like, well, we really need to increase coverage for people who don't have health coverage in the United States, and let's see what we can do, because they didn't want to scare off people on the right by being too ambitious. But 2/3 around the table, here's Stuart, who shares with Alan the British accent, and he says, well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm in favor of universal health care coverage. He goes, the Heritage Foundation? It's the first person to say universal health care coverage? And he went on to say, look, I probably think market-based approaches are a better approach than pure government approaches, but let's have that conversation. In that moment, they knew he was not an enemy. They knew they had an honest debate about where they wanted to go, that they weren't dealing with somebody who didn't care about the fact that poor people in this country didn't have coverage. So that's part of the answer, that in-person is really important. I will say, to answer, won't get to all the questions I can and retain what they were. If you have developed a level of trust, then you can move to more electronic means. It's better if it's visual than just on the telephone, but we're at a point now where when you have the trust in a room, you can magnify it. And there are people looking at using technology to create more relationships, and I'm not adept enough technologically to speak to that, but I'm confident that there will be ways that technology can assist us. But at some level, there's no excuse there's no substitute for breaking bread, looking in people's eyes, understanding their humanity. You can't get that, if you're not in the same room.
And realizing it depends on the subject, what one's position might be. I mean, if there are certain issues, I'd be more socialist. In some issues, I'd be libertarian. In another issue, more cultural things, I'd be conservative. Depends what the subject is. And to be kind of put into a box of one thing where we need to be able to trust each other to explore differences and possibilities seems to me very important. I'm smiling because there's a question about Vice President Pence at the Olympics and where he was sitting near Kim Jong's sister. But I don't think you have anything necessarily you want to add to that. But any advice you'd give to the Vice President? But I just appreciate someone writing that down. That was great.
I think that would be considered a slippery slope for me.
Slippery slope. You mentioned your success in reaching consensus on a federal budget process. Can you give us an example or two of the content of that consensus so that we can better understand how you brought divergent interests together?
Yes, and actually we can share sort of the broad outlines, not the exact agreement. So this group first agreed on principles. So it meant that, like everything's on the table. It's not just some things, not another. That the process shouldn't tilt toward one ideology or another, and that we needed to have a predictable and timely process and so on. And so the broad outlines, again, nothing's going to fix this if Congress doesn't want to fix it, is to get the Congress probably out of the annual cycle where they're always behind, they never get it passed, and maybe move more toward a 2-year kind of process where you set some goals that can last 2 years and you pass bills according to that. They can move more promptly. There's confusion in the public and amongst politicians. What is the fiscal status of the country? So it calls for a consolidation of information pulled together by trusted intermediaries, so at least we're arguing from the same facts. Because there have been very little political consequences from the budget shutdowns, we're going to try to tie it more closely to the election cycle and make sure it gets discussed in the context, especially of presidential elections. And there's a couple other basic principles. I actually have, maybe even in my briefcase here, an outline of what without giving away the store in terms of there's some very complicated negotiations on it. But the notion is, let's encourage as much political bipartisan cooperation. Let's strengthen the budget committees. Let's make sure that the other committees that are influential are part of the budget process. And let's put ourselves on a schedule that's realistic so that the country can function better. And I think a big part of our report is to actually identify, maybe more than ever before, the costs of this. Most people, again, the government closes, the government doesn't close, but their people's lives depend upon this. There are nonprofits that rely on government funding and they don't know if it's coming in. There are people who've got to build up funding reserves because they may have a hole in their budgets. As I say, there are contractors who give up, who are the best people we could hire to do work for the government, who give up in frustration because they don't know if the contracts are coming through. So there's a huge cost to this. So let me, for whoever's got that question, you can talk to me later. I may have a cheat sheet in my briefcase, and I give you a little more detail, but those are the general contours.
We're getting to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, how do I put this? What are the sources of information that you trust? I mean, I'm not asking you what news outlet you watch, or, I mean, where do you get your news?
Where do I get my news? Well, that's a great question. I mean,
it's unfair, but it's a good question. Yeah.
So, I think I try to be eclectic. I can tell you that I'm deluged. People send me articles and from all different perspectives all the time, and I will go through the newspapers of record to read summaries of them. And then there's a guy by the name of Mike Allen who puts out a daily column. It seems pretty on point. So, it's not so much what I rely on, to be honest. It's really what do the people I gather rely on.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I want to try to keep an open mind. And the kinds of people I come into contact every day means that there's a constant balancing of perspectives. So there's no easy answer. I live in Washington, so I read the Washington Post. I'll look at the Times. I'll look at the Wall Street Journal. And then I'll just try to sort through the deluge of columns that everybody thinks I should read every day, and I don't have time to do.
Yeah. Yes, I'll tell you, yes. I read The Economist, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and then become exhausted from that. And
well, I think, Alan, that you could be of great service if you could prepare a synopsis of that for me. And I would be happy to read your thoughts about it.
Doesn't seem
very erudite, so that's great.
Hardly.
We grew up reading the Poughkeepsie Journal, so we've come a long way since then.
The best thing I read is a thing called The Week. Do you know The Week? Because it really summarizes so many other things. Anyway, I find that very useful. But I want to thank you for such an important and wonderful conversation. Thank you for what you do here and in Washington. Good luck this week. Is there anything, a last word that you'd like to give to the audience, how they could get involved or follow up on some of these things? Anything you want them to take away?
So first, let me thank Alan for being such a gracious host. He's a member of our Leadership Council. He has made countless introductions for us to people, and has been a great source of spiritual guidance and support for me. We'll have lunch, and when I'm nearly crawled into fetal position worrying about the world, Alan starts moaning, and I feel better. So
when I start complaining, and he cheers up. Yeah.
Here's what I'd say. Look, everyone has their lives to lead. I know there are people here who lead. Everyone does remarkable work in your own way. You have your own interests. If I were to say there's one wish, it's to leave with a mindset that has us just feel open and as tolerant as we can. I'm not open and tolerant every moment of my life. I know that. But it's just like no one practices religion properly, fully, perfectly. What's your North Star? What kind of world do you want to have? And how do you support institutions that seek that? And then how do you carry it out in your own lives in a way that contributes to an overall culture that we want to have? And I actually do believe culture matters. I believe leadership matters. People who lead companies in certain ways can encourage cutthroat competition, and they may actually thrive in the short run, but if you read the best books on management, they don't thrive in the long run. And I believe we're able, within our organization and within the tables we create, to create a different culture that brings out the best in people. And that's what you want to do. So to the extent this talk has influenced anybody about how they want to lead their lives, they don't expect you to drop everything and run Convergence projects tomorrow. All of you have wonderful contributions to make, but I hope that it just encourages you to feel like there is a way forward here. There's hope and help how we get out of this. And I'd simply say that the kinds of people we've met, and they are warriors in the political wars in Washington, they all come out somewhat transformed, that there's another way of operating, and they actually tell us they're going out into the world operating differently. So I guess that would be the best I can do.
You remind me of a great line in one of Wendell Berry's poems, The Mad Farmer's Manifesto about Politics. He says, "Be joyful, though you've considered all the facts." So, thank you so much for coming to us. I wanted just to let you know that Patrick Thompson next week at 4 in the afternoon, please join Patrick. It's at 4 in the afternoon when his guest will be artist Keris Salmon, who will talk about her exhibit opening at the cathedral later this month on February the 17th, entitled "We Have Made These Lands What They Are, the Architecture of Slavery." A very important exhibition. So you're always welcome to join us upstairs for the 11 o'clock service. I want to remind you that we rely on your support for the forum, so please make a gift of whatever you can afford before leaving today. And then finally, a big thank you to Rob and Rob Fersh for joining me this morning.